Every New Mexican deserves to understand how the law works for them, or why it doesn't work for them. Welcome to New Mexico Legal Lowdown, hosted by attorney Feliz Rael. Each episode, we will help demystify the legal system and uncover misconceptions through real conversations with New Mexico trial lawyers. Produced and powered by LawPods.
This episode is brought to you by the New Mexico Trial Lawyers Association Alliance for Justice. We want to thank our La Justicia Circle supporters, Singleton Schreiber, Nick Rowley, Lori Benko, Sherry LaCour, and McGinn, Montoya, Love, Curry, and Sievers PA. Through their generous investments, they're safeguarding New Mexicans' right to access justice and a jury. And now, on to our conversation. Hi, welcome to the New Mexico Legal Lowdown podcast. We are trial lawyers or plaintiff lawyers talking about the civil justice system in New Mexico. The laws in New Mexico may be different from the laws in other states. The purpose of the podcast is to provide general information to demystify the civil legal process in New Mexico. This is not a substitute for appropriate legal advice in any individual case. Please contact a lawyer if you want to talk about your particular case. Today, I am very happy to welcome Kathy Love of McGinn, Montoya, Love, Curry, and Sievers PA. And our topic for the day is how lawsuits trigger change in the world. Welcome, Kathy.
Thank you. Thanks, Felice. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, this is such an important topic because I think people used to know this, but in the modern world, it's hard to remember. But first, I want to ask you, what made you decide to become a lawyer?
I wish I had one of those romantic stories of being 5 years old and having some experience that made me want to be a lawyer so I could help people in the world. I don't have that romantic story. Honestly, the fact is that I was pretty good at arguing from a very young age. But other than that, it really was a process of elimination. And, I think that we expect so much of our kids, these 16, 17, and 18-year-old kids going off to college, and we want to know, what are you going to do? What do you plan to do with your lives? And I think the truth is, most people don't have that romantic story. Most people need to go out there and experience the world, test some things out. And for me, it truly was a process of elimination. I remember initially I kind of thought I wanted to live in the big city. I grew up in Indiana, and so occasionally we would go up to Chicago, and I loved the big city, and I loved the idea of the women in their business suits with their tennis shoes on, commuting with their briefcases. So, I kind of figured out I definitely wanted to do something where I was always going to be learning. And I definitely wanted to do something where I was going to feel like I had an impact in the world. So I landed in law school, but I really kind of tested a bunch of different things out while I was in law school, including the thing that really made me figure out what I didn't want to do, which was I did some clerking for a corporate law firm that was doing patent and trademark infringement lawsuits. And I found it, and I'm sure for some people who are very scientifically minded or engineering focused, it can be very exciting. For me, it was totally lost on me. I found it boring, and it just wasn't my thing. And I realized that the day that I realized it was when they flew me down to Dallas, and we were all sitting around this dark conference room, boxes and boxes, dusty boxes full of documents with all these schematics in them. And we were supposed to go through all these documents and pull them to find the important documents that had to be produced in discovery. And I remember the fluorescent lights and everybody sitting around me kind of drudgingly going through these boxes. And I just threw up right there on the table. And I knew in that moment This work was not going to be for me. Very clearly was not my place. I found myself in New Mexico. I blindly put out a resume. I ended up in the firm that I am in. I took a little break from that to work in the public defender's office to get some trial experience, which I did and I loved that work. And then I came back to practice civil law.
That is such a vivid image of you sitting at that conference table with the lights overhead and just barfing all over the place.
It was like everybody's voices kind of slowed down, and it just was like this moment where, yeah, clearly that was not where I belonged.
And I think that's right. I think, you and I both have sort of children in the young adult kind of phase. And I think that that's good advice too, that it is important to kind of just explore different things and not feel the pressure to immediately make a choice.
Absolutely. I tell my son if his ultimate career choice is washing boats off of the coast of Thailand and hanging out with his friends and playing the guitar on the beach, that's fine as long as he explores what's out there, as long as he learns and exposes himself to all the different possibilities where he can make a difference in the world and also find, most importantly, find deep satisfaction. And if it's washing boats off the coast of Thailand, that's fine as long as he's done that exploration.
Sure. And as long as they don't limit themselves in advance and say, oh, I can't do that, or, I'm doing this because I'm expected to do this. It's important for me to know that for my son, that his value as a person is not dependent on what his job title is. Uh,
Absolutely.
and I think that that's important for lawyers to know too. Our value as people is independent. Being a lawyer is a skill, not an identity. And I think that, I don't know, I could go off on that. We could do a whole podcast on that. But ironically, I think achieve more when we sort of realize what our limitations are. Um,
Absolutely. And when we treat it as a craft and when we
yeah.
treat it as something that we are sort of developing and learning and reaching for excellence in a way that is in our integrity and true to who we are. Because, as lawyers, we all have, I mean, my law partner is one of the best lawyers in the country. We all have those lawyers who we look up to and we think they are what it means to be a lawyer, and we've got to emulate them and be just like them. And I think that that's exactly the wrong approach. We certainly learn from them, but we have to find our own selves, our own skills, our own style and personalities, and put that into the work.
Absolutely. And I think you've done an incredible job doing that and forging your own unique, highly successful path. Will you tell us a little bit about the kind of work your firm does?
Yeah, absolutely. Our firm is the firm that you hope that you never have to call. Because if you have called us, if you need us, it means the worst thing in your life has happened, which is you have lost a loved one, you have lost your health and well-being. We do wrongful death, serious catastrophic injury cases, whether they be caused by medical malpractice, failures of hospital systems, trucking companies failing to follow the rules of the road, premises liability, government accountability cases, anything where someone has had the worst thing happen to them because of a failure by really it's the big guy. We represent the little guys against the big guys.
I love that. And, it does seem like you're constantly learning something new when you have a scope of practice that's that broad. And I can see how that would be bring a new challenge every single day.
Absolutely. I have learned things I never thought I would ever even encounter.
Yeah.
I've worn hard hats. I've honked the horn of a semi truck, one of the best moments of my life as an Indiana girl. Spending time on the highways with my parents. I always thought that would be the most fascinating thing to be able to do, and I finally got to do it once at a trucking seminar. But yes, we learned so many things. We learn about complex medicine. We learn about trucking rules. We learn about different businesses we never would have experienced before.
I also think of your firm as the firm that is very solidly focused on policy change. And I remember at one point I had an office in the same building as your firm. And that was and I don't remember if the conversation was with you or someone else in your firm, but there was a really interesting negotiating strategy. And that was to always include an element of policy change in the negotiations. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. People need the law because they need justice. And so, what really is justice for someone who has lost a child? No one comes into our office and says, I lost my child or I lost my wife or husband and I want to be paid for it. That's
Right.
not what they do. They say, I want to do something to make sure that my loved one didn't die in vain. And what can they do to make sure their loved one didn't die for needlessly and with no purpose, no understandable purpose that allows you to put another foot, one foot in front of the other to the next day? And that is justice and accountability, and really importantly, change. Almost every single person who comes to our office says to us, I'm not the kind of person to file a lawsuit. I'm not a litigious person.
I hear that all the time too.
Yes, but I don't want this to happen to somebody else. I don't want some other family. I don't want another family to ever have to suffer like this ever again. They want change. So, what we like to do is we like to focus on not only what will get our clients the compensation that they have to be able to move forward, to replace a lost salary or to, pay for those medical expenses or the future medicals that they're going to need, but also what is going to be the catalyst for change. And there are a couple of places where that can happen. Sometimes you just have to go and kick somebody's butt at trial to make them change and do the right thing.
Because for a big corporation, sometimes money is the only language they understand.
That's exactly
They
right.
can make promises, but they will not make or commit to change unless it affects the bottom line.
That's exactly right. And the truth is that I'm not saying that the human beings in the corporations are evil people, but the nature of corporations, whether it be insurance companies, private equity owned hospitals, their jobs are to make money for their shareholders. And so they necessarily have spreadsheets and they work into the cost of doing business what they're going to have to pay out, and that includes lawsuits. And so many of them who are self insured will work that into their own ledgers. Many of them will purchase insurance to cover, that big, terrible thing that could happen and result in a really big verdict against them. And they just put it into their cost of doing business. So sometimes you have to make that ledger not match their expectations in order to make a difference and show them they have to make change so that this doesn't ever happen again. So their numbers aren't affected. But the other way that we can sometimes make change is by demanding change in our settlement demands. We believe in, and I think you do too, many travelers believe in taking every case as if it's going to go to trial. You don't have a client come in and say, here's my case, and you say, okay, we're going to get a quick settlement. That is fool's talk. That's not going to happen. I mean, the second you think that is when you're going to go to trial.
That's right.
So
That's one of the paradoxes.
it is. So you prepare every case as if you're going to go to trial. But when you're preparing your demand letters to the defendant who you're up against, you quickly find out who you're dealing with. Because what we like to do is we like to say, if you will make all of these policy changes, and we typically will come up with the policy changes that would have made a difference in this particular case, whether it be a policy change that would have saved somebody in the post-anesthesia care unit, or a policy change that would have identified a poor driving record of a truck driver. Make those changes and we'll settle for less. You can get out of this case for a lot less money if you will make a difference and make things safer in the future. But you really quickly find out who you're dealing with, because a lot of times you'll have a company that will be like, we're not going to go to that trouble. We're not going to go to that expense. We're not making those changes. We're going to roll the dice.
More often than not, I think that's the case.
Yeah.
It is extremely rare to find a defendant that is willing to say, yes, we'll implement this policy change.
That is true early on. But
Yeah,
what we
that's
have
true.
found is when you see the whites of their eyes, when you're on the courthouse steps and they are facing a really big judgment that would move that bottom line for them, that's sometimes when they are willing to make the changes. And just as you're saying, more often than not, they will refuse to make the changes during those settlement negotiations. More often than not, clients who have lost someone, even faced with the possibility of a much bigger verdict at trial, if they can get those changes, that's what they want, because you can't get the changes from trial. You
Right. And
can't.
that's so much more meaningful,
It is.
right? There's just no question that money can do meaningful things. I can think of, one person I know who, for that person, it was important to set up a scholarship fund. For other people, it's they want to even just, put up a memorial, or they want to provide the college education that their deceased loved one would have provided. So money can make up for a lot of things, but not everything. It's so much more meaningful, I think, to say, I helped make the world a safer place.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we hear, because we've been doing this for several years now, and I think a lot of trial lawyers are taking this approach because they recognize that that really is what our clients want. I've heard from some defense lawyers sort of a cynical perspective. You always say it's not about the money, but it really is about the money.
I've heard that.
Yes, but isn't the truth that it's kind of has to be about both? Because if a company can get away with just saying, oh, we'll put that policy in place that we should have had all along,
Right.
and we'll train our nurses on that policy that they should have been trained on all along. Really, unless they have to also pay, they're really not going to learn a lesson. They're not going to think twice in the future. I remember this trial that Randy and I did down in Las Cruces. This was a case against a doctor and, more importantly, a medical device manufacturing company.
I know about this. I'm so glad you're about to talk about it.
So Biotronic was a company that manufactured pacemakers and defibrillators. And pacemakers and defibrillators are implanted into people's chests to help regulate their hearts. They just sit under the skin in the chest, and then there are some leads and wires that go into the heart, and it detects when the heart isn't working properly, and it gives a little jolt. And sort of, this is obviously very, very shallow explanation of what they do, but that's essentially what they do. And so there was a doctor who was taking kickbacks from the company to convince patients that they needed pacemakers. And he convinced Our youngest client was in her early 30s,
Oh my.
beautiful woman who was fit and healthy, and she had some palpitations, probably hormonal palpitations. She goes to see the doctor, and the doctor convinces her that she's going to die if she doesn't have one of these things implanted in her. And
That is
he would
so
also,
outrageous.
it's outrageous, and he would do it he would convince them, some people would say, well, gosh, that seems a little drastic. Maybe I should get a second opinion. And he's like, you don't have time for a second opinion. You have to do this.
Mm.
So we had 34 clients who didn't need the pacemakers or defibrillators, and who this doctor got kickbacks from the company for being their big seller. So here's the closing argument that my law partner did at the end of this case, at the end of a couple weeks of trial. She was talking about how to hold this company accountable, not only through compensatory damages for the people, and this was a trial again for on behalf of just one of the plaintiffs, for the person who had this implanted, but also punitive damages. How do you send a message to this company that this is not okay? It is not okay to give kickbacks. It is not okay to prey upon patients. So, what she said is, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, at the end of this case, you're going to have an opportunity to send a message to this company. And, on the one hand, you could award punitive damages in a small amount, a slap on the hand of the company, and here's what will happen. The people in this room who have been the corporate representatives who have been watching this trial, they'll pick up the phone at the end of the case and they'll say, hey, they're calling their corporate headquarters. I've got some good news and I've got some bad news. The bad news is that we lost the case. Compensatory damages were awarded, punitive damages were awarded, and you're going to have to pay. The good news is they're small. It's a small amount. You can just work it into the cost of doing business, and we're good.
Yeah.
And so you have to send a message to this company. We're not asking you to break the bank. We're not asking you to put this company out of business.
Some
We're
companies
asking,
might need to be put out of
so
business.
you're right. I agree. I agree. I agree. But like with these private equity hospitals or the corporate hospitals in town, we don't want them to go out of business.
That's
We
right.
want them to do better. We
That's right.
want them to treat patients better. We want to send a message to their shareholders, to their stakeholders that causes them to say, you better put some policies in place. You better focus on patient safety. You better do what's right for the people who we're serving.
And it strikes me that there's a difference, right? Like in the types of companies. If it's a hospital, no, you don't want to put them out of business. But you do want to send a message. Although there are so many corporate healthcare companies that it seems to me that another one would swoop right in with no problem. But again, do we want to encourage that kind of conduct? And I think we give this actually a fair amount of thought. But there are other companies like some of these, I don't know, I was thinking about like the solar panel companies who go door to door. And there was another kind of cosmetic healthcare company that did some really bad things. And in my mind, yeah, maybe those companies should go out of business.
Absolutely.
Um,
Or our colleague's case where they were implanting or injecting medicine into men's private parts and telling them
right.
that they were going to have all of these successes, and they were actually really, really causing them serious damage.
Really harmful.
Yeah,
But even then, assuming even it is our intent to put a couple of companies out of business that we think really need to be put out of business, it's still really hard to do that because of all of the protections that defendants have. Number one is, there's the constitutional idea that punitive damages can only be 10 times compensatory damages. And that gets applied in different ways in different cases. And then there's also, assuming it's a small business. And by the way, that maybe I'm curious about your thoughts about whether small businesses are more inclined to change their policy than large businesses. That's been a theory of mine for a while, but I don't know what anyone else's experience has been. But for a small company, you know, maybe not the company itself, but the individuals have a lot of protections, more protections than people probably realize. I had this case, maybe it was a year ago, and we got a judgment against a man it was not a business case, but he was actually defrauding an individual and he stole about $250,000. And we got nothing. We got $0. We got the benefit of a judgment. And if he ever sells his house, maybe we can collect a little bit of money, but it's unlikely.
Yeah, but
But
you still made a difference. You still had your mark, and you still gave voice to your client. And to your question about the small businesses, I do think that the closer you are between the human who is hurt and the human who really is trying to do a good thing in the community and trying to make a living, trying to run a good business, the closer you are between those, I think that you find that the more willing they are to hear you about the changes that need to be made. They don't want this to happen again.
yeah,
Can I tell you a story?
yes.
This makes me think of one of my pet peeves, which is when people talk about, oh, that's just a liability. I have to do this because it's a liability. I have to make sure that this is safe because otherwise it would be a liability. It's a pet peeve of mine. It drives you crazy. How about I have to do this to keep things safe? When my son was an infant, I was doing some renovations in my kitchen. And there was this day when there I was holding this tiny little brand new, completely helpless and dependent little baby. While I was standing in the kitchen listening to architect, a contractor, and a cabinet maker arguing over how these cabinets were going to be installed. And I won't go into the detail about why it was complex, but it was a mechanically complex thing that they were trying to do. And they were arguing about, well, if this, then there's liability. If this, there's liability. If you want to take on the liability. And I finally stepped in and I said, excuse me, what I want to know is are these cabinets going to fall out and cause my baby brain damage someday when he's a toddler and he's starting to, climb up on stuff? Is my child going to be at risk of brain damage? And do any of you want that on your shoulders? Aside from what it would cost you in
Right.
terms of money, do you want that on your conscience? And I think the answer is no.
Right.
So let's talk about how to make this safe. Let's not talk about it in terms of liability. It drives
It's
me
a
crazy.
more human way of
It
looking at it.
is.
Liability is almost a divorcing of the humanity of the situation when the bottom line is we are talking about humans. And
People and their
yeah,
safety and their
right.
well-being.
Yeah, yeah. Oh my gosh. We want to take a quick moment to thank our sponsors. This episode is brought to you by the New Mexico Trial Lawyers Association Alliance for Justice. We want to thank our Adobe Pillar supporters, Fadul, Clough, Hardy, and Conaway, LLC, Poulos and Coates, and Tani, Acosta, and Chaparro, PC. Through their generous investments, they're safeguarding New Mexicans' right to access justice and a jury. Now, back to our conversation. I think at some point, and to their credit, maybe, or to the credit of the justice system, the auto industry has made really terrific strides in terms of making vehicles safer. I'm old enough that I remember when I was taking a driving school, they'd make us watch these old black and white movies, and there was the people like blood on the highway or something like that. So I think that the auto manufacturers are a good example of how industry has responded appropriately to lawsuits regarding safety.
Absolutely. I
When I was,
remember
yeah,
lying in the back of my dad's Ford Pinto on the highway, zooming along, watching the sky through the back window, and then of
yes,
course we find out that Boy, if you get hit from behind, that whole thing is going to go up in flames. So, yes, you're right. That is a place where, and I wonder why that is. Is that because that is something that touches everyone? I mean, we think we're not going to need to go to the hospital for a serious cardiac condition, but we all get in a car every day, most of
I
us.
think that's right. Even if you don't drive, you're a passenger in a car often. I think that's right. And I think that I wish that that everybody understood their vulnerability. Because nobody expects to have to go to the hospital. But maybe if they can put it in terms of their loved ones, we're all going to, at some point, have a loved one that needs to go to the hospital. We all, especially nowadays, rely on big semis, driving down highways to get our Amazon packages and our, food. And I think it's easy for jurors and humans and voters to just distance themselves from harm. But the reality is we're all vulnerable.
Right, right. It's defensive attribution. Really,
Ah, yes.
people think that wouldn't happen to me because here's what I would do to make myself safe. And it's not until you're actually in that position that you realize how you trust your doctors. You trust the hospital you go to, that they're going to have the policies that they're supposed to have. Or you trust the trucking company. Surely this big trucking company isn't going to put somebody on the road if they have 14 crashes on their record or they violate the rules consistently. But alas, it does happen. And how else to hold them accountable other than through a lawsuit, through
Right.
representation by lawyers, and going to court, which is really the great equalizer. It's the great equalizer between the little guy and the big corporations and the government.
That makes so much sense. And I think that there are different kinds of cases. There are some cases where genuinely it's an innocent mistake because we're all humans and humans make mistakes. But there are other cases, and I think this is the kind of case your firm focuses on, which is where there is a profound policy failure. And it is only the justice system that is going to have the gears and the levers that can ultimately change things, change those policies for the future.
That's right. And I do find that, our culture is shifting some. Our culture is shifting so much sort of in favor of individual responsibility and a lack of accountability on the bigger scale.
I
Um,
agree.
we're not holding our government as accountable. Our elected representatives are able to do things without checks and balances that our system put in place. And as I see that culture shift, what I'm also seeing is corporate accountability, corporate responsibility, safety is declining.
Yeah.
And it's a real concern that I have about our future. I'm hoping that shift will sort of, the pendulum will swing some, but it does concern me in terms of our future and safety in hospitals, safety on the highways, safety in stores, places where we go every day.
I bet we could spend at least another hour talking about that in
Absolutely.
particular. Um,
Absolutely.
Before I move on to the more fun, lighthearted topics of the interview, is there anything else that I didn't ask you that you do want to talk about on the subject of how lawsuits trigger change in the world?
Well, not only do they trigger change, if a corporation gets hit with a big verdict, they're going to make a change so that they don't have to do that again, so they don't lose that again. But I think that I do find that our clients are the most satisfied when they are able to walk away and know that they have made a change. And that really is true transformative justice. It really makes when someone can walk away. My law partners represented a young freshman at New Mexico State University who was raped in her dorm in 2022. And the university just did not seem to be taking the investigation seriously. The investigation was stalled, even though she got a long-term restraining order against the person who did this to her. And I think that they thought that she might just go away. But because of her resolve and her commitment and serious bravery, a woman who is assaulted, they get put through it all over again in the system. Their privacy, they have no privacy. They're accused, they're suspected, they're put down, they're dragged through all of this stuff. And this woman was so brave that she held out till right before trial, insisted on changes, and ultimately she got an important change, which is that the university is doing training of freshmen. And if you don't go through the training before you go to school, you won't get registered for your classes.
Wow.
And
That is
so
so wonderful.
it's amazing. And, that's her bravery and also my partner's badassery in holding out for that and insisting on and developing these meaningful changes that I think make a difference for everyone on campus. And it makes a difference for the university. That university doesn't want these things to happen. I think that transformative justice is it's why we do what we do. It's the whole reason to do this work is to make that kind of a difference.
That possibility is what keeps me going.
Absolutely. I mean,
Because
you just
otherwise,
had your
what
own
is the
trial.
point?
You
Right.
just had a trial yourself where you held someone accountable so that they stopped doing the bad behavior that they were doing and keeps elderly people safe.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's just astonishing to me that it's not more common for people to say, you know, I'm sorry, here's how I'm going to change things in the future. And oh, also, here's how I'm going to make up for what I did wrong. I thought that we all learned that as children, but somewhere
Yeah.
along the way, it gets lost. It gets
And
lost for ordinary people, but it especially gets lost for business interests.
yeah. And do you find also, Felice, that when we first started practicing, that it was more conciliatory, it was more focused on problem solving and reaching resolutions. Certainly there were battles and, we would go to trial and we didn't always agree. But it seems like that culture shift is also making litigation a little bit more hostile. It's making it so that we have to fight harder for what's right. Are you having that same experience?
I am, and I'm baffled at where that comes from, right? Like I felt like that was true when I was clerking in law school. It was certainly, I don't know whether or not that was true when I worked for a defense firm. I thought that that was generally true when I went back to doing plaintiff work, but right around when the COVID lockdown happened, I mean, I was just exhausted because a case where I felt like there was clear liability, and maybe there are arguments to the contrary, but it just felt like everything had to be a huge battle. And I never want to suggest that someone's not entitled to a defense, and I never want to suggest that a defense lawyer is not entitled to make a living to provide for their family. But I find that there are the people who I can have a reasonable discussion with, they're in the minority.
Mhm.
And people who I can say, when they can file a brief and it's totally against my client, and I can read it and I can say, well, I disagree, but I still respect where they're coming from, and their arguments are rational and they make sense, and this is a professional doing their job. I think that that's becoming less it's becoming less common, and it's
I
disappointing.
agree.
But I hope, I mean, I sort of hope, and I think that part of that has to do with a lot of marketing and the issue marketing and these issue campaigns. and they are really polarizing. And what I think I hope in part with this podcast series is to shed light on the humanity of what we do and the reasons we do it and the factors that go into it, in maybe in an effort to promote more reasonable, rational discussions. So
And I
I don't know if
appreciate
it'll
that. I
happen,
mean,
but
it's it's a great thing you're doing.
thanks. Well, I'm so lucky to have guests like you because your experience is just outstanding and your leadership in the community on a whole bunch of different issues and that in the leadership of your firm, I mean, has really been outstanding. I mean, I think your firm is like, top notch in New Mexico. So I'm so grateful that you took the time to talk to me. But before I let you go, I do want to ask you, what is your favorite either New Mexico day trip and or your favorite New Mexico restaurant and meal?
Mm. Well, my favorite, I don't know that this really qualifies as a day trip, but I do believe that the Gila Wilderness is the center of the universe. We
Ah.
are so lucky to have that space. And when I go there, it feels like so comforting to know that there are still relatively unspoiled places like that on earth. So to me, the Gila is just the very best place on earth. Favorite place for lunch, and we bring it into our office all the time, is Duran's.
Mm.
Duran's chili, we're all hooked on it around here. And, in fact, we recently had lunch in the office 2 days in a row, and all of us were like, Duran's again. So it's the best.
It is such good comfort
It's
food.
the best. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Kathy. Again, just so happy that you were willing to take time to spend talking to me this morning and to educate the people out there about your job and our job. Keep at it.
Elise, you and I could talk for hours.
Yes, we could.
Anytime.
All right. Well,
Thank
you have a good
you.
day, and I'll talk to you
Thanks.
soon.
You too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Before we wrap up, we want to thank our sponsors. This episode is brought to you by the New Mexico Trial Lawyers Association Alliance for Justice. We want to thank our Chili Circle supporters, the Tracy Law Firm, and Curtis and Company. Through their generous investments, they're safeguarding New Mexicans' right to access justice and a jury.
Thanks for joining us on New Mexico Legal Lowdown. If today's conversation changed how you see the legal system, share it with a friend. We'll be back next time with another trial lawyer fighting for New Mexicans. Produced and powered by LawPods.